There comes a point in a relationship between an avoidant person and someone who has quietly endured their behavior when something shifts completely inside the avoidant's mind. It happens when they finally realize you were never as unaware as they assumed. You were not blind to the contradictions, the confusing hot and cold behavior, the disappearing acts presented as simply needing space, or the emotional games hidden behind the language of personal boundaries. You noticed all of it. You recognized the repeated cycles, understood the defenses they depended on, and slowly began figuring out why they behaved the way they did. But instead of confronting every inconsistency or demanding explanations whenever they pulled away, you chose another approach. You stayed calm. You watched closely. You gave them room to reveal their real character, while quietly deciding whether this relationship truly deserved your time, energy, and emotional investment in the long run. That realization can deeply unsettle an avoidant because it completely changes the story they had created in their own mind. Suddenly, they understand that they never possessed the level of control they believed they had. Their behavior was not impossible to understand or impossible to notice. You were not staying because you were incapable of recognizing unhealthy patterns. You stayed because you were making careful and informed choices at every stage. The patience they interpreted as innocence was actually emotional discipline. The silence they assumed came from confusion was really observation. Rather than reacting to every emotional trigger, you were watching, learning, and deciding whether their actions actually matched the kind of future you wanted. And in that moment, they begin to realize they underestimated your awareness from the very beginning. They confused your calmness with weakness when it was actually evidence of strength, patience, and self-control. That realization changes everything. For a long time, the avoidant may have built much of the relationship around the belief that you did not fully understand what was happening underneath the surface. They assumed their emotional walls were subtle enough to remain hidden and believed their distancing behavior gave them the upper hand. They convinced themselves they were controlling the pace of the relationship while staying safely protected from vulnerability. But when they discover that you recognize the pattern all along, they are forced to reconsider almost everything. They begin seeing that every time they thought they were creating distance according to their own rules, you were simply allowing events to unfold while quietly paying attention. The relationship did not continue because you were desperate or unaware of the problems. It continued because you were giving them opportunities to grow, change, and demonstrate consistency before making your own final decision about whether they truly belonged in your life. While they assumed you were simply too trusting to understand what was happening, you were actually doing something far more intentional. You were observing with clarity instead of reacting from emotion. You were gathering information, comparing their actions with their words, noticing whether their behavior remained consistent over time, and deciding how much of yourself to invest based on what you actually saw rather than what you hoped would happen. This is what emotional maturity can look like in complicated relationships. You do not ignore warning signs, but you also do not rush into conclusions based on one difficult moment. You watch for patterns. You give situations enough time to reveal themselves. You allow behavior to speak repeatedly before deciding what it means. The avoidant's belief that you were unaware often says more about their own need to feel in control than it does about your ability to understand them. They needed to believe they were several steps ahead because that belief made their emotional defenses feel secure. But while they were convinced you had no idea what was happening, you were quietly noticing far more than they realized. You saw how their excitement could suddenly disappear without any clear explanation. You recognized the familiar cycle in which they became more interested when you stepped back, only to retreat again once you moved closer. You noticed how they could be affectionate, attentive, and emotionally available one day, then distant and disconnected the next, even when nothing obvious had changed between you. You also paid attention to how they described previous relationships, where similar patterns seemed to appear again and again. Former partners were often described as too emotional, too demanding, too needy, or too dependent. Instead of accepting those explanations without question, you noticed the common thread underneath them. You began recognizing that the same story could be repeating with different people. Piece by piece, you developed a clearer understanding of who they were long before they realized you had noticed the layers they worked so hard to protect. You also noticed how they seemed to leave themselves an exit whenever conversations moved toward the future. Their answers were rarely completely direct. They kept possibilities open, avoided firm commitments, and surrounded important conversations with uncertainty. You noticed how emotional limitations could be presented as personal preferences and how withdrawal could be described as nothing more than healthy boundaries. Instead of challenging every explanation or arguing over every contradiction, you quietly watched how these behaviors repeated. Your understanding did not come from emotional explosions or dramatic confrontations. It developed slowly as each new experience confirmed something you had already noticed. Little by little, isolated moments began connecting into a much larger picture. Every conversation, every withdrawal, every contradiction, and every sudden change became another piece of information. Eventually, you were no longer trying to understand individual incidents. You were understanding the entire pattern. And once you see the pattern clearly, it becomes much harder for someone to convince you that each individual event was meaningless. The descriptions felt strikingly familiar because they reflected exactly what you had been experiencing. You realized your relationship wasn't an isolated case or some impossible mystery. It followed patterns that had been studied and explained many times before. That knowledge gave you perspective. Instead of blaming yourself or assuming everything was your fault, you recognized that their actions reflected deeper emotional habits. This didn't excuse the behavior, but it helped you separate their internal struggles from your own worth and gave you the clarity to view the relationship more objectively. At the same time, you quietly tested whether your observations were accurate. Every so often, you gave them more space and noticed whether they suddenly became interested again, confirming the familiar cycle where distance attracted them more than closeness. You shared genuine emotional needs to see if they could respond with consistency or if they would retreat the moment vulnerability entered the conversation. You created natural opportunities for them to become more emotionally available and watched whether they embraced those moments or avoided them. These weren't games designed to manipulate anyone. They were thoughtful ways of understanding whether the patterns were temporary reactions or deeply rooted habits. You weren't trying to control the outcome. You were gathering enough evidence to decide whether this relationship had real potential or whether the same emotional cycle would continue repeating no matter how patient you remained. While observing their behavior, you were also carefully managing your own emotions. You understood that chasing them every time they pulled away would only reinforce the very dynamic keeping the relationship stuck. Constantly confronting every inconsistency would likely strengthen their defenses rather than encourage meaningful change. So you responded differently. Instead of reacting immediately, you stayed calm and gave yourself room to think before acting. That calm wasn't approval, and it certainly wasn't acceptance of unhealthy behavior. It was a conscious choice to avoid feeding the cycle. You knew emotional outbursts would either become proof in their mind that you were too demanding or provide temporary reassurance without changing anything in the long run. Rather than rewarding their distance with pursuit or responding with unnecessary drama, you simply observed their actions and allowed them to reveal exactly what they were capable of giving. Throughout this entire process, you protected something even more important than the relationship itself. You protected your connection to your own reality. Their mixed signals could easily have made you question your instincts or wonder if you were expecting too much. Instead, you trusted what you consistently observed. When they said they cared but repeatedly acted in ways that created emotional distance, you chose to believe their actions instead of comforting words. When they claimed they wanted a future together while continually avoiding real intimacy, you acknowledged that contradiction instead of explaining it away. You refused to convince yourself that your feelings were irrational simply because they preferred a different version of events. Quietly trusting your own judgment while remaining composed required emotional maturity they never recognized. They mistook your patience for ignorance, your calm for acceptance, and your thoughtful observation for blindness. Believing you didn't truly understand allowed them to continue behaving the same way, never realizing you were giving them every genuine chance to grow, change, or finally prove that lasting change was actually possible. By refusing to react with panic every time they withdrew, you gave them room to become aware of their own behavior if they were willing to face it. Your calmness wasn't passive. It was intentional. You showed them what emotional security looked like through your actions instead of your words. By holding healthy boundaries without turning every issue into an argument, you demonstrated the kind of relationship dynamic that could actually succeed. You gave them countless opportunities to meet you with the same level of maturity, not because you believed change was guaranteed, but because you wanted absolute certainty before deciding whether to stay or walk away. Deep down, you understood that avoidant patterns are usually deeply rooted and rarely shift without serious personal work. Still, you wanted to know you had been fair, patient, and honest with yourself, leaving without doubts or regrets that you had overlooked something important. Throughout that entire process, your goal was never to wait endlessly for them to transform. Your goal was clarity. You wanted to fully understand the relationship before making a permanent decision. That meant watching consistent behavior instead of isolated moments, separating promises from actions, and allowing enough time for genuine change to reveal itself if it was ever going to happen. Every observation strengthened your confidence because your conclusions were based on evidence rather than emotion. You weren't clinging to hope, nor were you rushing toward disappointment. You were giving yourself enough distance to see the relationship clearly, rather than allowing one emotional moment to determine the meaning of everything that came before it. Not because you believed change was guaranteed, but because you wanted absolute certainty before deciding whether to stay or walk away. Deep down, you understood that avoidant patterns are usually deeply rooted and rarely shift without serious personal work. Still, you wanted to know you had been fair, patient, and honest with yourself so that if you eventually left, you wouldn't be haunted by doubts about whether you had overlooked something important. Throughout that entire process, your goal was never to wait endlessly for them to transform. Your goal was clarity. You wanted to fully understand the relationship before making a permanent decision. That meant watching consistent behavior instead of isolated moments, separating promises from actions, and allowing enough time for genuine change to reveal itself, if it was ever going to happen. Every observation strengthened your confidence because your conclusions were based on evidence rather than emotion. You weren't clinging to hope, nor were you rushing toward disappointment. You were building a complete understanding so that whether you chose to stay or leave, your decision would come from certainty instead of confusion. That quiet confidence became one of your greatest strengths, even though the avoidant person completely misunderstood it while the relationship was unfolding. Eventually, there comes a moment that completely changes the avoidant person's perspective. They suddenly realize you were never unaware of what was happening. You understood their behavior all along. And that realization can be deeply unsettling because it destroys the version of the relationship they had created in their own mind. They believed they were protecting themselves while staying one step ahead. They assumed you couldn't fully understand the emotional patterns they relied on. Then something happens that makes it impossible for them to hold on to that belief. Whether it's something you calmly explain or a decision you quietly make, they finally see the difference between how they imagined you and who you actually are. In an instant, they recognize that the control they thought they had was based on assumptions that were never true. One of the most powerful moments happens when you describe their behavior with calm accuracy instead of emotional frustration. After months of repeating the same cycle, you might simply explain that you've noticed they consistently pull away whenever the relationship becomes emotionally closer. You point out that it has happened enough times for you to recognize the pattern before it even begins. You explain that you understand this may be connected to discomfort with intimacy, but that you can no longer remain in a relationship where emotional closeness is repeatedly followed by distance. You aren't accusing them or trying to hurt them. You're simply describing reality. Hearing their behavior reflected back with such clarity forces them to realize you've been paying attention all along. Your calm tone reveals that you've already processed the situation emotionally, making your words far more powerful than any emotional confrontation could have been. Another moment of realization often comes when your boundaries surprise them. They withdraw, expecting you to chase them, only to find that you remain peaceful and continue living your life. Or they return after disappearing, assuming you'll immediately welcome them back, only to discover that you've spent the time reflecting on whether the relationship still deserves your investment. Instead of expressing relief, you calmly explain that you're uncertain about continuing unless you see consistent change over time. In that instant, they understand that you weren't sitting around waiting for them. You were evaluating them just as carefully as they believed they were evaluating you. Their absence didn't increase your dependence. It gave you the distance needed to see the relationship more clearly. That realization completely changes how they view your emotional strength and independence. Sometimes the truth becomes obvious when you casually mention an old situation they assumed you had forgotten. You recall a specific moment from months earlier, explaining that you recognized even then how discussions about commitment or future plans triggered their anxiety. You tell them you chose not to argue because you wanted to understand the pattern rather than force a temporary solution. They suddenly realize you weren't ignoring those moments. You were quietly documenting them in your own mind. That recognition can bring several emotions at once. They may feel shocked that they underestimated you, embarrassed that their behavior was more transparent than they believed, uncomfortable because their sense of control begins disappearing, and sometimes even impressed by the emotional intelligence you demonstrated. At the same time, they may fear that your understanding means their familiar coping strategies will no longer work because you now recognize the pattern before it unfolds. And this realization changes everything. The strategies they depended on lose much of their power once they are fully understood. The mixed signals no longer create the same confusion because you recognize them as part of a repeating emotional pattern. The sudden distance no longer automatically sends you into pursuit. Silence no longer becomes a puzzle you feel responsible for solving. You simply observe. And that may be the moment they finally understand something they never expected to discover. You were never powerless in this relationship. You were simply choosing patience while you gathered enough information to decide what was right for you. Your calm was never ignorance. Your patience was never desperation. And your willingness to understand them was never permission to be treated without limits. You were watching, learning, and deciding. Once they realize that, the entire dynamic changes because they can no longer assume you will remain available regardless of how they behave. They finally understand that your presence was a choice, not a guarantee. And when someone realizes that the person they thought they could always return to has developed the strength to walk away, they are forced to confront a truth they may have avoided for a very long time. They didn't have control over you. They only had access to you for as long as you continued choosing to give it. While they believed they were directing the emotional pace of the relationship, you were quietly deciding how much energy to invest, what behavior to accept, and when enough evidence had accumulated to make a final decision. That quiet control gave you far more power than they realized. Every inconsistency you noticed, Every withdrawal you mentally recorded and every defense you recognized added another layer to your understanding until you possessed a complete picture that no single argument could ever provide. As time passed, your silence became stronger because it allowed evidence to accumulate instead of forcing you to react to isolated incidents. When you finally chose to speak, you weren't reacting to one disappointing moment. You were describing months of repeated behavior that formed a consistent pattern that made your words difficult to dismiss because they weren't based on emotion or assumptions. They were based on observation. Your calm explanation carried far more weight than repeated confrontations ever could because it reflected careful thought rather than temporary frustration. Another advantage of your quiet observation was that it revealed who they genuinely were. Because they believed you weren't carefully evaluating them, they behaved naturally. They didn't constantly manage the impression they were making or temporarily change their behavior simply to avoid criticism. Without realizing it, they showed you their authentic emotional habits, limitations, and coping strategies. They gave you an honest picture of what life with them would actually look like. In many ways, you understood their emotional world more deeply than they understood it themselves. While they were focused on controlling situations and protecting themselves, you were focused on recognizing patterns. You weren't reacting to isolated moments or allowing one conversation to define the entire relationship. You were observing the system underneath everything. You were noticing what happened before they pulled away, what triggered their defenses, and how the same emotional cycle kept repeating in different forms. And when they finally realize this, something inside them shifts. They are forced to acknowledge that you had been operating from a deeper level of awareness throughout the entire relationship, quietly recognizing truths they had never fully confronted within themselves. That realization creates an entirely different balance between the two of you. Many people with avoidant patterns place a high value on intelligence, emotional control, independence, and self-sufficiency. So discovering that you possess those same qualities can create a strange mixture of admiration and discomfort. They begin to see you differently because they understand that you are no longer someone who can easily be confused by mixed signals or distracted by temporary displays of affection. You have already learned how their patterns work. You recognize the disappearing acts. You recognize the sudden changes in warmth. You recognize the contradictions between what they say and what they repeatedly do. In the end, the relationship cannot continue under the same conditions that once made avoidance comfortable for them. They can no longer depend on confusion to maintain control or assume that you will continue accepting inconsistent behavior without recognizing what it means. The emotional strategies that once helped them feel protected begin losing their effectiveness because they are no longer happening unnoticed. You see the pattern now. You understand the defense beneath it. And most importantly, you understand that recognizing the reason behind someone's behavior does not require you to tolerate its consequences. From that point forward, the relationship has only one meaningful choice. It must evolve into something built on honesty, accountability, consistency, communication, and mutual effort, or it must eventually come to an end. There is no longer room for the old cycle to continue simply because both people are familiar with it. The foundation that allowed that cycle to survive has disappeared. Your quiet observation created that turning point. Your willingness to eventually speak the truth gave it a name. And your boundaries determine what happens next. Whether the relationship survives or ends, it can no longer move forward on illusion. It has to move forward on reality. And perhaps that is the most important outcome of all. You protected your dignity. You protected your emotional well-being. You protected your ability to trust your own perception. You stopped allowing confusion to become the foundation of connection. You finally understood that genuine intimacy cannot depend on one person constantly interpreting, waiting, adjusting, and making excuses for the other. Real connection requires two people who are willing to see each other clearly. And now, They know something they may never have fully understood before. You saw the truth all along.